with the revisionist Western thing. It's like these guys aren't black and white. They're not heroes. They're not villains. I mean,
Oh, they're
you've got,
villains. They're
well,
villains.
they're kind, yeah. As I say that, yes, so they're kind of villains. But
The
one of
movie starts off, they throw the bank teller out the bank so he could get riddled with bullets because they thought he was a bandit, you know? One of the main protagonists, Ernest Borgnine, I think it was him that grabbed the woman as like shelter as he was
yeah,
like in the middle of a shootout. These guys
yeah.
are terrible fucking people, man.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And it's like a reversal too, because it's a brilliant opening sequence. It's the credit sequence of this movie. And I have to say that I find a lot of modern movies, they don't really have a credit sequence the way this movie does. A lot of modern movies, they just sort of do credits over top of some fancy design, and they're not really telling any story. And I suspect they're farming it out to some other company and saying, make our credits for us. But they're just kind of a waste of time. But here you're actually seeing the story unfold, you're hearing dialogue, you're getting to know these people. But what's great is that they're dressed as soldiers, right? They ride into town dressed like soldiers, and they behave in a pretty good way. They salute people, they're polite, and you think, oh, these are good guys, right? Until they wind up in the payroll office of the railroad, and it's a robbery, and it turns out that they're bad guys. And you're right that they do some terrible things, right? And they're very self-interested, right? They want to protect themselves at all costs. They want to get the money at all costs. They're not heroes, definitely not. But and that line that you mentioned there, if anyone moves, kill them, or whatever the line is, that's kind of where the credits end. Like, it's the perfect kind of punchline to that opening sequence. He says the line, and I think it says directed by Sam Peckinpah, and that's the end of the credits. And it kind of puts the little punchline on that whole opening sequence, and I think it's brilliant. But the gunfight, when you talked about that gunfight, and how you do learn about the characters through that gunfight, it's also like just an amazing scene. And sometimes you hear, when you make a movie, they'll give you this piece of advice that you should put your second best scene first, and then your best scene at the end. And I don't know that Sam Peckinpah would have been thinking in those terms. I'm not sure that anybody had ever said that before this movie was made. But this scene is so good. When you're watching it, you're kind of thinking, well, how can there ever be a better scene than this? Like, how's it going to top this, right? This is such a crazy, amazing gunfight, and there's so much going on there, right? And the editing is amazing, and the use of slow-mo, which I guess is one of the Sam Peckinpah trademarks. I remember as a kid, I didn't know who Sam Peckinpah was, but the movie The Osterman Weekend came out, and I think they were emphasizing, this is Sam Peckinpah's movie, The Osterman Weekend. And I was like, who's Sam Peckinpah? And I think I was told, well, he specializes in violent movies with a lot of slow motion gunshots and slow motion killing. And so that was kind of the way he was described to me. And I guess it's partly because of this, because there's a lot of slow motion, and it's very effective, right? It's a very, very effective sequence. I'm not sure why I started talking about this exactly, but it's a great, great opening sequence. And yeah, you're right, they're terrible. And one of the things I was going to say about this movie is that there's darkness at every turn. Do you get that feeling? Like every step of the movie, there's darkness. There's something. If it's not the scene itself that's dark, there's something that happens sort of connected to it that's dark, And I mean, right at the beginning of this movie, we see those kids throwing scorpions onto an anthill and watching the scorpions get killed by the ants, and it's just like, I found that so incredibly disturbing. Like, what the hell is that?
Yeah, I think the story goes, it might have been the producer heard that story and he got on the phone and said, "Get me some ants and scorpions right away."
Yeah, well, I guess it's sort of I guess you have to read it as almost a metaphor for these characters. You know, you've got the wild bunch, if we can call them that, the outlaws, and then you've got the bounty hunters who are kind of chasing them, and they're being led by one of their former friends.
Yeah, let's talk about that relationship. That's a great relationship with Thornton, Robert Ryan, and William Holden, who's great in this, in Pike. So those are two guys that I loved when I used to watch the older films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They came in a lot of really great black and white films. Here they are a little bit older, middle-aged, two great actors, and giving great performances. You almost wish they shared the screen a little bit more. Kind of reminds me a little bit of De Niro and Pacino. They're in Heat and they're in The Godfather Part 2, and they're giving these great performances. You almost wish they were on screen more. But the dynamic between those two, told in the flashbacks, in the beginning gunfight scene, it's played out in a way, it's like, man, there is something between those two. The flashbacks makes it so much more tragic, because here you have this guy, William Holden, he's kind of aged and grizzled, and he has these codes that he goes by. And you hear him going by these codes and yelling at his men. And then you, in the flashbacks, you see he kind of contradicts all of that. But to really contradict it, he would have to go by those codes and then break them. But you almost see why he's going by those codes is because he did the opposite. You almost have to learn the hard way. No, you don't do this, because you'll end up where I am now. You don't turn on your friends. You don't walk away. You don't do all of these things that I did. You realize that he did in the flashbacks. And it's really tragic, because honestly, Robert Ryan, Thornton character, should have been the leader of the Wild Bunch. He was the one that was like, hey, let's get our shit together and get out of here, you know? In another world, you'd love to see a movie where they're like co-leading the Wild Bunch, going on these crazy adventures, but you know, you have them going against each other. I think that storytelling, the way they told that story between those two, and their performances were really, really good.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, part of it for me is, you know, if we look at it as the ants and the scorpions, right? Who are the ants and who are the scorpions here? I'm not sure, but you've got, you know, a former outlaw who's kind of leading these bounty hunters, and you've got the outlaws. Which one of those two groups is the better? You know, which one of those two groups is more admirable? I mean, the bounty hunters seem like a bunch of idiots.
Is neither, is can I go with option C, neither?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. I think they're both kind of, neither one of them are the good guys and neither one of them are the bad guys. They're kind of...
So there's one thing that it's always taught. If you want to make a character that's not likable to the audience, make them really good at what they do. And I think that's what draws you into the Wild Bunch before they have their redemption at the end, is that they are terrible people. They have no redeeming values as far as who they are as people, but they're really good at what they do to an extent. You're drawn to them because you're seeing them pull off these wild things and getting away with it. And even Robert Ryan's character, he was like, I wish I was with them instead of you. You know, even though he's out to kill them, he's like,
that's right.
Oh, man, I wish I was with, you know, the bunch instead of these, you know, bandits. I loved all the Wild Bunch too. Like I think all four characters were great, even though like Warren Oates and Ben Johnson didn't get as much character development. I thought Warren Oates was great. In a movie bleak like this, you need some kind of comedy relief occasionally. And you watch like these Marvel movies where they have these tension scenes and it's supposed to be this tragic scene, then someone quips a joke and it's like, what? Like, what am I watching? Like, tonally, how are you making that fit there? I think the humor with the Warren Oates character was blended in so well. It was genuinely funny. It broke the levity to a certain extent, but it didn't break the fourth wall. It kept you in the movie while still adding levity.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things where the darkness really enters for me right off the top is that they leave a guy behind, right? At the robbery, they leave one of their gang members behind and they basically say, okay, you stay here and you keep them, you know, keep them under control. You keep watching them.
And why didn't you tell me he was your grandson?
Yeah, exactly. They find out later he's the grandson of a friend. But yeah, I mean, it's like, they must know he's either going to die or he's going to go to jail, right? Like there's no other option for this character.
Yes,
They're
they
leaving,
fully knew that.
they
And
leave him
that's
behind.
crazy. And that's another great part of the storytelling is that this guy is despicable. He's torturing those people. He's laughing giddily like the Joker. He's
Yes.
completely psychotic. You're happy that he
Yeah.
gets. You're happy that he gets. And he ends up shooting them. They run off screen, but it's implied that he killed all of them. It just as he's about to die, he then guns down these three people that shot him right before he dies. Again, he's good at what he does. In that, even as he's dying, he takes three bandits with him. So you
Yeah.
kind of like him a little bit because he's good at what he did. And then you like him even more because you're like, oh man, like you felt sorry for him because he's the grandson of a likable character. Why are
Yeah.
you making me feel sympathy for this piece of shit? You know, come on, movie.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. And then I guess the punchline to that whole opening sequence is when they get away, and one of their gang members is hurt, right? He's got serious problems. I think he's blinded, and so Pike just kills him, right? He just shoots him dead, um, which is shocking, I think, to the audience who's used to seeing heroic characters. Um, it's just kind of a brutal moment. And I think the guy kind of wanted it. I think he wanted to be put out of his misery, but it's still a brutal moment. It's dark. It's the darkness again.
It's a brilliant movie, brilliantly performed, brilliantly directed. Peckinpah made a lot of great movies. Straw Dogs, one of my favorites. People talk about Die Hard and Home Alone. Which one pioneered that booby trapping the home to get people? Well, Straw Dogs kind of did it before both of them. Straw Dogs was great. He did The Getaway, which was great. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, which is just one of the great odd movies out there. He has an incredible filmography, but to me, this
Mhm.
stands head and shoulders above all of them. This
Yeah.
is the unflawed masterpiece in his filmography. What flaw can I find in this movie? I mean, this is one of the best movies I've ever seen. And
Yeah.
it's not a first time viewing. I've seen it
Mhm.
multiple times, and this is the most I've enjoyed it. This is a movie over 2 hours. It
Oh
breezed
yeah.
by because of the pacing. You have the gunfights, you have some mystery, you have some tension, you have the storytelling where they kind of inch you along piece by piece, telling more of the story as you go with the flashbacks. I thought it was just brilliant. I enjoyed the characters despite myself. I can't think of anything negative to say about this movie.
No, I can't either. And I think I've seen it 4 or 5 times, and I agree. I say it gets better every time I watch it. I think it's one of those movies that you just see more and more in. There's a lot of detail in this movie. It's a fairly simple story, but it's a very detailed world, and I think that you get the sense that there's a lot more going on outside of what we're seeing. You're kind of getting glimpses of the world that we're in, and it's just a rich movie. There's a lot there,
Mm-hmm.
and I agree. I like the characters in spite of their not so noble tendencies. Um, but I think that they are fun to watch, and they are ultimately likable, and they do kind of do a good thing in the end. Although I think their motivation might be questionable. I think everything they do is sort of motivated for personal reasons, but I think that I don't know that they're setting out to do good so much as to ease their own guilt and maybe make themselves feel better. But they still do something good. And yeah, I don't know. I think I can't think of any reason not to like this movie.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of the people who didn't it was because it was so violent. It was like unprecedented, the level of violence.
It's a pioneer for as far as violent films and violence on screen. It's
Hmm.
incredibly violent and it's incredibly dark. It's just a well-told story.
Oh yeah.
It's not violence for violence sake. It's not torture porn.
No.
Everything has a purpose.
Yes.
Everything has a purpose. even the character, like that psychotic character at the beginning of the movie, finding out he's the grandson of one of the main characters, it suddenly added more story to something that you thought was just throwaway violence. It's like, no, it paid off at the end. It enriched the story, added
Yeah.
more layers to what you're watching.
Well, it kind of added to that whole sense of their own guilt, right? They have left people behind, you know, including Robert Ryan maybe in the past, and including that guy, and then later in the movie they leave someone else behind, and I think they finally kind of go, you know what,
And they're
we're done
leaving,
with
and
this.
they're running
Yeah,
too. He even said that.
yeah,
He's like, I'm tired of running. They're
yeah,
leaving. You're right. They're leaving people behind. They're constantly running. And Holden's character, Pike, said, I'm tired of running. They could have ran away after they
yeah,
killed Mapache. They were just like, no, we're just fucking tired of running. Let's just do this.
yeah,
Let this be our last stand.
yeah. Um, that is a great moment. It's one of my favorite moments, I think, in any movie.
As great as that moment was, it's probably my second favorite moment. One of the best moments in this movie. And one of the best hairs on the back of your neck stand up moments is that march.
Mm,
When
yes.
he's like, let's go, Warren Oates' character says, why not? And
Hmm.
they load up their shotguns with
Yes.
saying very little words. And they
Yeah.
start doing that walk to Apache. And
Yeah.
they're walking past all the villagers and the music is going. It's just,
Yeah.
man, if you can't
Yeah.
get hyped for that, it's not,
Yeah.
it's not the shootout that gets you. It's the build up, the anticipation of the shootout
Yes.
that gets you too. Yeah,
Oh
that
yeah.
march
Yeah.
was just brilliant.
Yeah. I agree actually, and I must admit I'm a fan of that kind of scene. I know this is a completely different movie, but one of my favorite moments in Halloween is when she walks from the house where she's babysitting across the street to the other house where she knows her friends might be in trouble. And it's done in real time. We just see the walk all the way across. And this is similar in the sense that we get the walk all the way from the brothel, I guess, where they are, to the place where the general and his army are hanging out. And yeah, it's there's something about that walk over there. Um, and it also made me think of a gunfight at the OK Corral. You know, the famous story of the characters who have the showdown there. They walk to the showdown, and I almost wonder, is this a bit of a reference back to that? Um, maybe, maybe not, but it's yeah, I love that moment too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this was just an ad lib moment from Peck and Paw, and they were
Hmm.
just putting the scene together as they went. As the story goes, he started shooting and told them to walk, and then the cinematographer, they're all watching this, and they're second unit directors, and they start calling extras over to be in that pathway as they're walking.
Oh
Hey, you
yeah,
sit down there, have a conversation, you do that, and let's keep pulling out this lens and keep this walk going as long as we can.
cool.
So I guess I'll just give my final thoughts on why I'm such a huge Peckinpah fan and why I'm such a fan of this movie. At the time when I first saw this movie, I was watching a lot of movies. I was really studying film, and I was trying to figure out who are the great directors, who are the great actors, what are the great films in each genre. I was really trying to be a student. I was soaking as much things in as I possibly could. And then the more you watch movies, the more predictable they become. And the more you feel manipulated. Well, I'm supposed to like this person, I'm supposed to not like that person. This is what happens in Act One, this is what happens in Act Two, this is how you should tell a story. And then you come into a filmmaker like Peckinpah. Wait a minute, this isn't how you tell a story. Why is that guy getting away with this? Why am I following? He doesn't look like a movie star. She doesn't look like the lead actress. And they don't look the part. They don't act the part. This is kind of different, but it's interesting and it's good and it challenges you. Wait a minute, okay, let's see where he goes with this. And it's not just that he's doing something different, but he's doing something different with a purpose. Oh, well, you're doing that, I'll do this. He has a plan. There's logic to what you're watching. It challenges you, it rewards you. I'm just drawn to him as a filmmaker, and I'm drawn to this film because it's not what you expect. It doesn't disappoint, and it rewards you for going down this journey. And again, when I first saw this, I thought this was just an amazing film. I was shocked that it was done under such a big budget. Usually, unconventional films are like little indie movies. Yeah, they let Peckinpah be Peckinpah. And they only really did it once for a huge budget, kind of like Orson Welles with Citizen Kane. Sometimes you only get away with it once, but sometimes you only need to get away with it once to make an impact. And he certainly did with this film. And I'm a huge fan of his. It's sad that he had such a tragic life. It's sad that, he gave in to alcoholism, and from what I've read, he really gave into cocaine and other drugs, and almost like he wanted to die at a certain point. Died way too young, but he does have a pretty vast filmography, a lot of great films, and I think that this is a great jumping off point for anyone not familiar with his work, whether you like westerns or not. If you like interesting storytelling, if you're tired of seeing the same characters in the same stories, I think this is definitely something that you should check out. It's a great introduction to Peckinpah. Yeah, I can't recommend this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This movie was groundbreaking in its day, shocked audiences, shocked critics. I think a lot of the critics didn't like it. Some critics did, like a young Roger Ebert was one who championed this film, who saw what was important about this film. And I think you hit the nail on the head early on when you say it's about kind of the end of the era. It's about the end of the Wild West. I think that's something that Peckinpah was very interested in. I think in a lot of his movies, and and I find that very interesting as well. I also like stories about older characters. Why do we always see stories about teenagers these days? I'm sick of that. Let's see older characters. Movies like this are far more interesting to me. And one thing I think is should be mentioned, perhaps, is that the extreme violence in this movie, Peckinpah, apparently his intention was that it would somehow be a catharsis for the audience, and that through watching this extreme violence, they would somehow, not be violent. It would somehow get the violence out of them or something like that. But he kind of admitted later on that, yeah, it didn't work. The audience just kind of liked it, kind of liked watching the violence. So it didn't really work, but it was kind of meant to be, having worked in television so much with all the Westerns there, where they show people getting shot, but there's no blood. It's not particularly ugly. He wanted it to be ugly, and he wanted it to be extreme. And I think it is. This is very effective use of the cutting, the slow motion, the extreme.
This had the most cuts for any movie at the time when it was released.
Yeah, yeah.
And just to add on to what you said about the violence, I think the violence in this movie is what made it infamous. And the violence in Peckinpah's film kind of defined his career because he would have movies like this with extreme violence. There's Straw Dogs. And then he would have movies like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and other movies where there'd be no violence at all. And it would they'd be box office flops because it's like, what am I watching? I came here to see the Wild Bunch. What is this?
Yeah.
What is this like love story I'm watching? What is this drama I'm watching? So when
Yeah.
he didn't have the violence, people didn't watch his movies. And
Yeah.
when he did have the violence, people criticized the violence in his movies. So he was defined by it, whether he did it or not. And this movie became popular and infamous because of the violence. But honestly, leaving the violence out of it, because obviously it's not going to have the impact now that it had then. It's a great movie, and he made a lot of great movies. But you're right, the violence didn't come off the way he wanted it. That was a negative as far as like what he was trying to accomplish. And it was also a negative because it hurt his career. When he didn't have the violence, he no one watched, and when he did have
Mhm.
the violence, he got criticized.
Yeah. But in terms of the technical aspects, the use of the slow motion and the different speeds and all that cutting, all the coverage that he shot, that was kind of unheard of at the time, and it's become more standard now. And somebody suggested that in a way it was as influential as Citizen Kane was in its day in terms of how to technically shoot a film. It's kind of
Now you're
you're not
losing me, man.
you're
Now
not
you're
prepared to
losing
go
me.
that far.
No, no,
No.
no. I think you went a little too far there, buddy. Okay,
I hope
let's take a step back. Let's take a step back.
little
Okay,
too little too far.
a lot too far. I love this movie. Let's not compare it to Citizen Kane, please.
Well, it wasn't me. It was someone else who made the comparison. But I found that interesting because yeah, I think filmmakers like Tarantino are kind of famous for doing all this insane
I'm
amount of
surprised you bring
coverage.
up Tarantino. I thought you bring up Zack Snyder, the king of slow
Well,
motion
sure,
action.
yeah, sure, why not? Yeah, but I think prior to this, that was not really the norm. People didn't shoot that kind of coverage, and they didn't. I mean, as you said, it had the most cuts of any film up to that point. So it was technically influential, but aside from that, it is just a great movie. It's a great story, and I think it's emotional. I think it's powerful. I feel something when I watch this. Um, I don't get that from a lot of other modern films. You mentioned the Marvel films. I don't really get the same emotional feeling from them as I get from this. So yeah, I think this is definitely a movie that people should see, and if they haven't, and it's one of the great movies of all time.